Have you ever been told you didn't belong, even when you had every right to be there? Imagine sitting in a first-class seat you paid for, ticket in hand, only to hear the words, "This seat is not for people like you." No questions asked, no boarding pass checked, just judgment. What would you do? Would you argue? Would you shout? Or would you stay calm, knowing that every second was being recorded, every word exposing something much bigger than you? This isn't just a story about one man. It's a story about a system, about silence louder than outrage, about a trap that was never meant for the passenger, but for the airline itself. How far can discrimination go before it destroys the very walls built to protect it? And what happens when the person they try to humiliate turns out to hold the power to change everything? Stay with me, because this is the story of Marcus Hale, a man who refused to move, a man who turned humiliation into transformation. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the powerful stories ahead. Have you ever been told you didn't belong in a place you paid to be? That thought circled quietly in my mind as I stepped through the jet bridge into the cool, recycled air of Flight 482. The aircraft smelled faintly of coffee, carpet cleaner, and the metallic tang of anticipation. Business travelers shuffled forward with their phones already out, tapping emails as if the world would end if they didn't hit send before takeoff. Families corralled restless children, and somewhere behind me, a man argued loudly on his Bluetooth about quarterly earnings. I carried only a single black leather briefcase and a folded boarding pass. My ticket said first class, seat 1A, a window seat tucked neatly in the very front row. For most passengers, that number would have meant nothing more than legroom, a faster drink, a little comfort in the sky. For me, it felt like a test. I wore no suit, no polished shoes, no tailored jacket, just a charcoal hoodie, dark slacks, and worn sneakers that had seen more airports than sidewalks. My watch was simple, black strap, no Rolex glint. I preferred it that way. I had always believed power walks quietly. Still, I could feel the weight of eyes on me as I turned left at the cabin door. First class glowed with soft lighting, wide cream leather seats, and the hushed tone of money trying not to announce itself. A couple of passengers already seated gave me the kind of glance people give when something seems out of place. A quick up and down, a pause too long, a tiny tightening at the corner of the mouth. I ignored it. I always ignored it. Seat 1A greeted me with its pristine headrest cover, a folded blanket, and a glass of water perched on the armrest. I set my briefcase down, smoothed the boarding pass, and settled in. The seatbelt clicked softly, and for a moment, I exhaled. The hum of boarding around me faded into white noise. This was supposed to be a quiet flight from Boston to San Francisco. 6 hours in the air. Enough time to rest, reflect, maybe catch up on a manuscript draft I had been carrying in my bag for weeks. But peace rarely lasts long when the world insists you don't belong where you are. She arrived moments later, tall, lean, with the posture of someone who had memorized every rule in the handbook and decided she was the one chosen to enforce it. Her name tag read Linda Carver. She was the lead flight attendant, and even before she spoke, her eyes gave me away. Not because of anything I had done, but because of everything she thought I was. Her gaze was sharp, scanning me like I was a suspicious package left unattended at a terminal. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "This seat is not for you," she said flatly. I blinked once, certain I had misheard. "Excuse me." She leaned down slightly, lowering her voice but sharpening it like a blade. "Sir, you're in the wrong seat. First class is for full-fare passengers only. My first instinct was to laugh, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity was so familiar. Instead, I breathed in and kept my voice calm. This is my assigned seat. I reached for my boarding pass and held it out. She didn't take it. She didn't even glance at it. She let it hover between us for a beat, then finally plucked it with 2 fingers, as if it might soil her hands. The pass had my name, Marcus Hale, printed clearly in black ink. Flight 482, Seat 1A, First Class, confirmed, paid. Linda looked at it as though she was humoring a child, then handed it back without checking. "Anyone can print one of these at home," she said with a tight smile. "You'll need to move to the back." The words landed heavier than they should have, not because I doubted my place, but because everyone else within earshot heard them too. The businessman across the aisle, navy suit, Bluetooth earpiece still glowing, smirked into his phone. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes said enough. I placed the boarding pass back into my wallet, my fingers deliberate, unhurried. I had learned long ago that silence, when used with precision, can be louder than any protest. Inside, though, a storm whispered, a tug of war between anger and restraint, between the part of me that wanted to stand and demand recognition, and the deeper part that knew battles aren't always won by volume. I thought of my father, who used to say, "Don't let them push you into being the man they already think you are." So I stayed seated. I folded my hands over my lap, and I waited. Around me, the cabin buzzed softly with tension. A young woman 2 rows back glanced nervously between me and Linda, her fingers curling around the phone in her lap. She tilted the lens ever so slightly, the tiniest red light blinking once before she adjusted her grip. She was recording. I didn't acknowledge it, not yet. Linda, clearly unsettled by my lack of movement, stiffened. "Sir, I'll ask you again. Move to the back." I met her gaze with steady eyes, my voice still calm. "This is my seat. It's paid for. You're welcome to verify that with the manifest." She scoffed, straightened her clipboard against her chest, and for the first time, I saw it not certainty, but control beginning to slip. And in that moment, I knew the flight had not yet left the ground, but the story had already taken off. Linda didn't move away. She planted herself in the aisle beside my seat, as if her presence alone could unseat me. Passengers filed in behind her, slowed by the confrontation. Some craned their necks to see what was happening at the very front of the plane. Others pretended not to notice, eyes fixed on their phones, scrolling as though that glow could shield them from discomfort. The businessman across from me, still on his Bluetooth, leaned back in his seat and smirked like he was watching a show he'd already seen before. His voice carried just enough to be heard. "This is first class, not open seating." His chuckle drew a few quiet laughs from the row behind him. Linda didn't reprimand him for speaking out of turn. Her attention was locked on me, her lips pressed into a thin line. She straightened her uniform jacket and said louder, for everyone in earshot, "Sir, this seat is not yours. You need to relocate immediately." The words stung, not because I doubted my right to be there, but because I could feel the invisible lines they drew in the air, lines that separated who belonged from who didn't, lines passengers around us were already beginning to trace in their minds. I held her gaze, steady and calm. "My boarding pass is valid. The seat is 1A. My name is Marcus Hale. I am where I am supposed to be." Her eyes narrowed. There was no curiosity, no professionalism in her expression, just certainty that I didn't belong. "I don't care what the paper says," she snapped. "Anyone can fake one. I've seen it before." I felt my jaw tighten, but I breathed in slowly, letting the air settle in my chest. This wasn't new. I had been questioned in boardrooms, mistaken for staff in hotels where I was the keynote speaker, asked for ID in neighborhoods where I had lived longer than most of my neighbors. The story was old, but it never stopped burning. A few seats back, the young woman with the phone shifted again. She angled her screen to capture both Linda and me, the tiny red light blinking as if it were pulsing with the heartbeat of the cabin itself. Linda extended her hand, palm open, waiting. Show me another form of ID. Something real. I reached slowly into my wallet and pulled out the card that carried more than just status. A sleek platinum elite membership card, embossed with my name, 8 years of flying, thousands of miles, dozens of upgrades, all etched into that strip of metal. I held it out with calm precision. Linda barely glanced at it. Her laugh was sharp and dismissive. Fake. Easy to order online. She waved it off and pushed the card back toward me with 2 fingers. Something in the cabin shifted then. A murmur. A ripple of discomfort, like people watching a line being crossed but not knowing whether to speak. The man in the suit across the aisle, however, had no such hesitation. He leaned forward, Bluetooth finally tucked away, his voice dripping with arrogance. You heard her, man. Some places aren't for everyone. First class isn't something you stumble into. It's earned. His words hung heavy, echoing louder than the engines that hadn't yet started. Some passengers smirked, a couple chuckled under their breath, and others shifted uncomfortably. But no one contradicted him. I looked at him, then back at Linda. I thought about responding. I thought about explaining, reminding them that money had been spent, that a ticket had been bought, that the airline itself had assigned me this seat. But I knew better. Explanations in moments like this don't soothe. They only feed the doubt. So I leaned back in my seat, slid the boarding pass and membership card carefully into my wallet, and placed it back in my pocket. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and said nothing. That silence unsettled Linda more than any argument could have. She shifted her weight, cleared her throat, and glanced down the aisle as if looking for backup. Control was slipping, and she knew it. Sir, she said louder this time, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter of boarding passengers. You must comply with crew instructions. Move to another seat or I will escalate this further. My heart pounded, but my voice remained steady. You may call whoever you need. I will not move from my assigned seat. The businessman across the aisle, his name, I would later learn, was Charles Denton, snorted like this was entertainment. He's holding up the flight. Just move him already. And with those words, the cabin became a stage. Some passengers leaned in, eager for conflict. Others looked away, desperate not to be part of it. And a few watched with quiet intensity, their eyes flicking between me, Linda, and Charles, as if measuring the truth with each glance. I breathed deeply, grounding myself. The urge to snap back was there. The temptation to rise and make a scene pressed hard. But I reminded myself of the truth I had carried my whole life. They expected anger. They expected an outburst. They expected me to confirm the caricature they had already painted in their minds. So I did the one thing they weren't prepared for. I stayed still, calm, collected. My silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. I could see Linda's jaw tighten. The clipboard in her hand shifted against her chest as she pressed her radio. Her voice came out clipped, each syllable stiff with frustration. We need a supervisor at the front, now, around us. The boarding slowed. The murmurs grew. A child somewhere in the middle rows asked his mother why the plane wasn't moving. She hushed him quickly, eyes darting toward the front. Charles leaned back, smirk widening. Here we go, he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. I glanced at him once, briefly. His grin faltered when he saw the calm in my expression. He expected rage. What he saw was resolve. The young woman recording shifted again, steadying her phone. Her eyes met mine for just a second. Not pity, not amusement. Something else. Recognition. Linda stood straighter, her shoulders pulled back, eyes locked on the cabin door. The supervisor would come. She would make sure of it. And she believed, with every ounce of her certainty, that when he arrived, I would be the one exposed. But as I sat there, steady, silent, watching the weight of the cabin press against me, I knew she was wrong. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It never was. It was about what happens when the system convinces itself that dignity is negotiable. And I had already decided I would not negotiate mine. The aisle had grown quieter, though not because boarding had finished. It was because the energy in the cabin had shifted. People no longer shuffled by with the usual impatience of travelers eager to sit down. Instead, they paused, even if just briefly, to glance at the scene unfolding in the very front row. Some shook their heads, others whispered, and a few simply avoided eye contact as if silence would keep them safe from being involved. I sat still in seat 1A, hands folded loosely on my lap, my boarding pass and membership card back in my wallet. I wasn't going to perform anger for them. I wasn't going to raise my voice to prove what the ink on the ticket already confirmed. My presence was evidence enough. But evidence, I was beginning to see, wasn't the problem. The problem was belief. Linda Carver stood rigid in the aisle, her lips pressed into that tight line again, the kind that said she wasn't just enforcing policy. She was protecting a boundary she thought was hers to draw. Her eyes kept flicking down the aisle toward the boarding door, searching for backup. And then it came. A man in his late 50s appeared from the galley, wearing a navy blazer that looked as though it had been pressed just this morning. His hair was thinning, his jaw set in permanent disapproval. His name tag read, Richard Lawson. He didn't need an introduction. His presence carried the weight of authority. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice clipped. Businesslike. Linda wasted no time. "This passenger is refusing to move from a seat he doesn't belong in," she said quickly. "His documents are suspicious. He's holding up departure." Richard glanced at me once, then at the businessman across the aisle. Charles Denton smirked and gave a small shrug as if to say, "See, even the crew knows." I met Richard's eyes calmly. "My boarding pass says seat 1A. My name is Marcus Hale. You are welcome to check the manifest." Richard exhaled through his nose, already impatient. "Sir, I don't want to escalate this. If you'll just move for now, we can verify after takeoff." The phrasing was deliberate. He wasn't interested in fairness. He was interested in logistics. Keep the flight on schedule, avoid paperwork, minimize cost. Linda jumped in before I could respond. "He's stalling. He won't comply with instructions." Her words sharpened on the last sentence, like knives being laid on the table. I could feel eyes on me from every direction now. The murmurs swelled again. One woman whispered, "Why don't they just check the list?" Another replied, "They probably already know." Richard took a step closer, his blazer brushing against the edge of my seat. "Sir, last warning. Please move to another seat." I felt the weight of the moment pressing against me. Inside, my thoughts raced. If I moved, if I stood now, I would be confirming every suspicion, every whisper, every smirk from Charles Denton's lips. But if I stayed, the escalation would continue. And escalation was dangerous, not just for me, but for how people would perceive me. The world rarely gave black men the luxury of being seen as calm when authority decided otherwise. I breathed in, slow, deliberate. My father's words echoed again. Don't let them decide the man you are. I will not move, I said softly. This is my assigned seat. You have the tools to verify that. Use them. Richard's jaw tightened. He glanced at Linda, and she seized the moment. Should I call security? He nodded. Yes, let's remove him. We'll figure out the rest later. The words dropped like a hammer in the cabin. Remove him. The authority of it was absolute, the kind of language that carried centuries of weight. Around us, passengers shifted. Some nodded, relieved the delay would soon end. Others looked down, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Charles Denton leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and said in a voice loud enough for the row behind him, "Told you. Some people just don't know their place." A sharp gasp came from a passenger 3 rows back. A young woman muttered, "Did he really just say that?" The tension wasn't silent anymore. It was alive, breathing through the cabin like static before a storm. I sat still, my hands steady, my voice calm. "Before you call security," I said, turning to Linda, "I recommend you check the manifest again. Carefully." She gave me a look of pure annoyance. "Why? Because this decision," I said evenly, "will be the most expensive customer service mistake of your career." Richard snorted. "Are you threatening us?" "No," I said. "I'm documenting you." Linda pressed her radio again. "Security to gate 12. Now." The hum of the plane seemed to drop lower, quieter, as if the aircraft itself was waiting for what would happen next. The murmurs swelled. One passenger whispered, "If he has documents, why won't they just look?" Another said, "Because they don't want to see them." Behind me, the young woman with the phone, Sophie Nguyen, though I didn't know her name yet, sat with her device angled perfectly. Her face betrayed nothing, but her hand was steady. She was recording every second, and I let her. Richard folded his arms. Linda stood tall beside him. Charles leaned back again, smug satisfaction painted across his face. To them, the outcome was already written. A stubborn passenger removed, a delay avoided, order restored. But I knew better. This wasn't the end of a confrontation. This was the beginning of a story. Inside, my chest burned with the quiet fire of restraint. Every part of me wanted to shout, to demand, to call out the injustice as it unfolded in plain sight. But I didn't. I stayed still. My silence was deliberate. My patience intentional. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight the storm. It's to let the storm expose itself. Richard checked his watch. Security is on their way. You'll be escorted off the plane. I looked past him, past Linda, past Charles Denton's smug grin, and let my gaze fall on the window beside me. Beyond the glass, the tarmac glistened under the Boston sun. Aircraft moving slowly across painted lines. Ground crew guiding luggage carts and fuel trucks. The world outside continued as if nothing inside mattered. But I knew it did. I knew this moment, captured in pieces by a quiet passenger with her phone, would matter far beyond this cabin. I sat still in seat 1A, not because I wanted the confrontation, not because I wanted the attention, but because dignity is not something you surrender just to make other people comfortable. The engines hadn't started yet, but the real flight had already taken off, and we were climbing fast. The moment Linda's radio crackled with confirmation that security was on the way, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted again. It wasn't just tension now, it was judgment. Passengers began to take sides in silence. You could see it in the way they leaned, the way their eyes lingered or darted away. Some stared at me with the expectation that I should just get up, save them the inconvenience. Others sat stiffly, troubled by what they were watching, but too unsure of their place to intervene. Charles Denton had no such hesitation. His smirk widened as if he had been waiting for this moment since the first word was spoken. He leaned forward in his seat across from me, resting one arm on the armrest and the other draped casually across his knee. His voice carried, just loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "First class isn't begged for," he said. "It's earned." The words rolled off his tongue with the ease of someone who had spoken them in different ways his entire life. The entitlement, the superiority, the certainty that his seat was a throne and mine an intrusion. I didn't look at him, not immediately. I had learned that sometimes the sharpest response is not to acknowledge arrogance at all. But the silence stretched, and his words began to fester in the air. A passenger 2 rows back gasped softly. Another muttered, "That's too far." Charles didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He leaned back, satisfied with himself. "You know, it's funny," he continued. "Every time I fly, there's someone trying to sneak into places they don't belong. It slows everyone down. Some of us actually have places to be." Linda didn't interrupt him. Richard didn't scold him. Their silence was permission. My hand rested loosely on my lap, my breathing steady. But inside, the war raged. Part of me wanted to speak, to tell him about the years of work, the miles traveled, the businesses built, the nights without sleep that earned me not just the money for this seat, but the right to sit in it without explanation. Another part of me wanted to remain silent, to let his words echo for what they were, unchallenged and ugly. Finally, I turned my head just slightly, enough to meet his eyes for the first time. Calm, unblinking. Charles faltered for half a second, his grin twitching before he caught himself. He expected fire. What he got was steel. I looked away again, not because he won, but because he was irrelevant. That stung him more than words could have. Linda, however, seized the silence to reassert herself. "Sir," she said, her voice louder, sharper now, "your refusal to comply is creating a disturbance. If you don't move, security will remove you by force." Richard stepped closer, folding his arms. His face was stone, but his posture radiated impatience. "We don't want to cause a scene," he said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "Step off the plane voluntarily, and this ends here." I breathed in again, letting the weight of the moment settle. Around us, the cabin was no longer pretending to be indifferent. Passengers were openly watching now. Some whispered in outrage, others in agreement, but the line had been drawn. Everyone knew this wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about belonging. My voice was calm, but firm. "I am not moving. This is my seat. I paid for it. You have the ability to verify that with the manifest, but you refuse to. That choice is not mine. It is yours." The clarity of the words seemed to cut through the air. For a brief second, silence held. Then Charles chuckled again, leaning forward with mock sympathy. "Look, man, don't make this worse on yourself. You think sitting here is going to prove something. You're embarrassing yourself. We all see it." A murmur rose from behind him. A woman's voice called out, "He's not embarrassing himself. You are." Heads turned. Charles stiffened, surprised by the pushback. Linda snapped her head toward the woman, eyes narrowing, but the passenger didn't flinch. She was middle-aged, traveling alone, her face flushed with quiet anger. She said nothing else, but her interruption had cracked the silence. I saw it then, the shift, small, but real. Sophie Nguyen, still holding her phone, adjusted her angle again. Her eyes flicked between me and Linda, capturing every second. The red light pulsed steady, like a heartbeat. She hadn't said a word, but her recording was louder than anything Charles Denton could mock. Richard's radio buzzed at his side. He pressed it once and muttered a clipped response. Then he turned to Linda. "Security is on the way. 2 minutes." Linda nodded, her lips curling into something close to victory. She turned back to me, her voice carrying through the cabin. "You had your chance to comply. This is the consequence." I stayed silent. My stillness was deliberate. Every second that passed made the injustice more visible. Charles, however, couldn't resist another jab. He leaned forward once more, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough to escape the ears of those nearby. "When they drag you out, just remember you brought this on yourself." My eyes flicked to him again, just briefly. Enough for him to see the calm that hadn't cracked. Enough for him to understand that no matter what happened next, this wasn't his victory. Inside, my mind was racing. The urge to defend myself roared like a storm, but layered over it was something stronger: patience. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of proof that the system didn't fail in secret, but in public. Proof that arrogance, when unchecked, reveals itself louder than any protest. And so, I sat still in seat 1A, watching the storm gather. The murmurs grew again, louder this time. A man behind Charles muttered, "This doesn't look right." Another whispered, "They didn't even check." Small voices of doubt threading through the silence. Linda stiffened, sensing the shift, but she held her ground. Richard glanced toward the door, impatient for security. Charles shifted in his seat, no longer smirking as confidently as before. And me, I stayed exactly where I was, calm, silent, waiting, because storms always reveal themselves in the end. And this one was just beginning. The cabin door gave a sharp knock. 2 quick raps, official and heavy enough to quiet even the murmurs. Linda straightened instantly, her eyes shining with relief. Richard exhaled, folding his arms as if the problem was finally about to be carried away. Charles leaned back in his seat with a grin, ready to savor the spectacle. The door opened, and in stepped Officer Elena Torres. Her presence filled the narrow galley before she even spoke. She was in uniform, badge gleaming, radio clipped at her shoulder. Her expression was composed, not aggressive, but firm, the kind of look that carried years of experience in tense situations. She scanned the cabin in a quick sweep before settling her eyes on me. Something flickered there. Recognition, not of who I was, but of what this was. Linda wasted no time. "Officer, this passenger is refusing to comply with crew instructions. He presented suspicious documents and is sitting in a seat he did not pay for. We need him removed immediately." Her voice was sharp, confident, rehearsed. She had already written the story in her head. Richard added his weight. "We've given him multiple chances. He's delaying the flight. Passengers are growing restless." The words were strategic. Delay meant fines. Delay meant complaints. If they framed it as a logistical problem rather than a discriminatory one, they could justify whatever came next. I sat still, calm, hands folded. I looked directly at Officer Torres. She stepped closer, her voice measured. "Sir, could I speak with you privately in the galley?" Her tone wasn't confrontational. It was careful, respectful even. She wasn't rushing to judgment. She wanted space. I nodded once, stood slowly, and adjusted the sleeves of my hoodie. A few passengers sighed with relief. To them, it looked like the problem was finally being resolved. Charles muttered, "Finally," under his breath. As I stepped into the galley with Officer Torres, Linda exhaled triumphantly. Richard didn't say a word, but his folded arms loosened slightly. They thought the matter was closing. They didn't realize it was just beginning. Inside the galley, the noise of the cabin dulled. Torres kept her voice low. "Your credentials." I handed her my boarding pass, my Platinum Elite card, and the ID they had dismissed. She studied them carefully. Unlike Linda, unlike Richard. Her eyes scanned the names, the holograms, the seals, her brow furrowed. "I had them verified," I said evenly. But they refused to check. They dismissed them without a glance. She pressed her lips together, tapping the edge of the boarding pass against her palm. "They've already filed a report," she said quietly. "It states you presented falsified documents and refused multiple lawful orders." Once that's in the system, my discretion gets thin. Her honesty landed like a stone in my chest. "So it's official. I don't want it to be," she said, her eyes flicking to the cabin. Then back to me. "But I need you to cooperate for now. Let me walk you off calmly. If there's an error, we'll fix it on the ground. Fix it on the ground." I had heard that phrase before. It always meant the same thing. Bury it. Silence it. Delay until the world had moved on. I nodded once. "I'll walk." She gave a slight nod of relief, then stepped back into the cabin, her voice steady. "Sir has agreed to accompany me off the aircraft." Gasps rippled through the rows. A couple of passengers nodded approvingly, satisfied the disruption was ending. Others looked uneasy, their eyes flicking from me to Linda to Richard. The young woman, Sophie Nguyen, kept recording. Her phone angled steady, her face unreadable. I stepped into the aisle beside Torres. Linda exhaled loudly enough for the first rows to hear. Finally. He should have just complied from the beginning. Charles chuckled, sliding deeper into his seat. "Play stupid games," he muttered. The man behind him finished the phrase with a grin, "win stupid prizes." They laughed together, the sound sharp and cruel in the hushed cabin. I didn't respond, not to Linda, not to Charles, not to anyone. My silence was heavier than their words. As Torres led me forward, I caught sight of Sophie again. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. But her steady gaze told me everything. She was still recording, still documenting. That was enough. We reached the cabin door. The jet bridge loomed beyond it, silent, gray, sterile. Torres stopped just inside the threshold, lowering her voice again. "They'll file this as refusal to comply. You could be charged." I looked her in the eye. "You know this isn't right." She held my gaze, her lips pressing tighter. "Finally," she said softly. "I do, but right and regulation don't always walk together." Her honesty was a crack in the facade, small, but real. I stepped onto the jet bridge without looking back at Linda or Richard, without looking at Charles Denton gloating in his seat. I only looked once more at Sophie, who still held her phone steady. Our eyes met for less than a second, but it was enough. The cabin door closed behind me. Torres walked beside me down the jet bridge in silence. When we reached the terminal, she exhaled audibly and turned to face me. "I'm not filing a charge," she said, "but they may press one through internal security." I nodded. "Understood." She hesitated, then asked, "Who are you?" I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I walked to the window where the plane was still parked. I pulled out my phone. A message blinked across the screen. Phase 2 in progress. Upload confirmed. I sat in the waiting lounge, surrounded by travelers who had no idea what had just happened beyond that glass window. On the tarmac, the plane began to push back, engines humming. Inside, Charles Denton was no doubt stretching his legs in seat 1A, savoring his hollow victory. Linda was probably smoothing her uniform, proud of herself. Richard was filing his report, convinced he had handled the problem, but none of them realized that their every word, their every gesture, their every dismissal had been captured, and the world was about to see it. 30 minutes. That was all it took. From the moment the plane's wheels lifted off the runway to the second the first major outlet picked up the clip, 30 minutes was enough to turn a private humiliation into a global headline. I sat in the terminal lounge, phone resting on the table beside my untouched coffee. On the screen, the first notifications began to cascade. A video posted from an anonymous account, no profile picture, no biography, just one handle, Truth in Transit. The caption read, "This is what discrimination looks like at 35,000 feet. Decide for yourself." Attached was the video Sophie Nguyen had captured from her seat. 9 minutes of unbroken footage. Linda dismissing my boarding pass without looking at it. Richard waving away my Platinum Elite card. Charles Denton's mocking laughter. My calm refusals. Every detail visible, every word audible, every act of dismissal preserved in high definition. The internet did not hesitate. Within 5 minutes, the video had 3,000 shares. Within 10, it had 20,000. By the 15-minute mark, hashtags were already trending. Seat 1A. Atlas exposed. Dignity denied. And then came the outrage. One tweet read, "This isn't just a mistake. This is bias in action." Another, "He showed proof. They didn't even look. This is how injustice works." Screenshot spread of Charles Denton's smug grin, paired with captions like, "The face of entitlement." Linda's dismissive gestures circulated alongside. She didn't even check. Richard's clipped commands were transcribed into viral posts. The story was no longer about one man being escorted off a plane. It was about a system exposed in real time. At the 20-minute mark, CNN picked it up. Their chyron was blunt. Black passenger removed from first class despite valid documents. CNBC followed, then BBC, then Al Jazeera. The story leapt across oceans before the plane even cleared the Midwest. In the lounge, I watched it all unfold in silence. Travelers nearby glanced at their phones, murmuring. One woman gasped softly, then looked at me. Recognition dawning. She didn't say anything, but her eyes lingered long enough to confirm she knew. I said nothing. The storm didn't need my voice. It had already found its own. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, the video had 6 million views. The airline stock ticker flashed red across financial feeds, dipping 6% in early trading. Their press hotline rang nonstop. Their legal department drafted, revised, then scrapped statements. But the internet was faster than any corporate machine. Within an hour, screenshots of internal employee reviews surfaced on Reddit, naming Linda Carver in multiple past complaints. Anonymous users claimed they had reported her for biased behavior years earlier, only for nothing to be done. Another thread alleged Richard Lawson had signed off on those very reports, closing them as insufficient grounds. The narrative hardened. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. Meanwhile, Charles Denton's name surfaced within hours. LinkedIn profiles matched his face. Old conference photos appeared on Facebook. Within the day, his company was flooded with angry messages. The internet had turned his arrogance into a calling card. I leaned back in my seat, eyes on the muted television across the lounge. The anchor repeated the headline as footage of the incident looped behind her. Atlas American Airlines is under fire tonight after a viral video shows a black passenger being removed from first class despite presenting valid documents. The airline has yet to issue a formal statement. The crawl beneath her red Seat 1A hits 10 million shares. Stock plunges 7%. And still, I said nothing. Silence was no longer mine to hold. It belonged to the millions watching, sharing, demanding. The first official response came at the 90-minute mark. The airline's Twitter account posted, "We are aware of the video circulating regarding Flight 842. We take these matters seriously and are conducting an internal investigation." Too late. Replies poured in instantly.
You don't investigate discrimination. You end it. He showed you the documents. You ignored them. We've seen this before. We're not buying excuses. The company's attempt at control had collapsed before it began. My phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. One-line Phase 3 confirmed. Assets secure. Sophie Nguyen, though the world didn't know her name yet, had already uploaded the file through encrypted channels.
It wasn't just on Twitter anymore. It was mirrored across dozens of platforms, embedded on news sites, cached on servers. It couldn't be erased. That was the beauty of truth in the digital age. Once lit, it spread like wildfire, impossible to contain. As I watched, hashtags shifted again, not just Marcit 1A or Atlas Exposed. A new one emerged. Hale stands, my last name, spoken by strangers, carried not as a label of a victim, but as a banner of defiance. The irony was not lost on me. They had tried to reduce me to silence. Instead, they had amplified my voice louder than I could have ever spoken alone. By the time the plane touched down in San Francisco, the video had been viewed 15 million times. Journalists were already waiting at the gate, cameras ready, questions sharp. Passengers from the flight stumbled into the terminal, their faces caught in the glare of the cameras. Some shielded their eyes. Others spoke freely. One woman said, "I watched him show his boarding pass." They wouldn't even look. It was wrong. Another added, "That businessman mocked him." It was disgusting. The airline could no longer frame it as a misunderstanding. The narrative had been set, not by press releases, not by executives, but by passengers, by witnesses, by truth. And I was still sitting quietly in a lounge 3,000 miles away, watching it all unfold. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here, and Atlas American Airlines was directly in its path. By the time the West Coast sun began to dip into late afternoon, Atlas American Airlines was already in free fall. The video had crossed 30 million views. Hashtags filled every feed. News outlets cut into programming to replay the confrontation again and again. But the real storm wasn't on social media. It was inside the towering glass headquarters of Atlas American Airlines in downtown Chicago. Elaine Turner stood at the head of a conference table surrounded by executives. Her posture was stiff, her jaw set, but her eyes betrayed fatigue. She had been on calls since noon. Investors had flooded her inbox. Journalists had left voicemails demanding statements. A senator's office had already requested an urgent briefing. Around the table, the leadership team spoke over one another. "We need a suspension immediately." One vice president insisted. "Suspension won't cut it." Another snapped. "The internet already dug up her complaint history. If we don't act decisively, we'll be accused of a cover-up." Stock dropped another 4% in the last hour. The CFO muttered, eyes glued to his laptop. "If this keeps up, we'll trigger automatic shareholder alerts by close of market." Elaine raised a hand. The room stilled, though uneasily. "We are not here to panic," she said. Her voice was steady, practiced. "We are here to control the narrative." But even she knew the words sounded hollow. The head of communications leaned forward, tapping his pen nervously against a pad. "The problem is, the narrative is already out of our hands. We can't spin a 9-minute video. We can't dismiss 30 million viewers." Elaine's silence confirmed what they all feared. "Then we need a fall person." Someone else said, "Carver is obvious. Lawson too. We announce immediate disciplinary action, shift blame, and promise new training." The idea hung heavy in the room. It was tempting, quick, convenient. But the silence that followed made clear it wouldn't be enough. Across the table, another executive spoke quietly. "This isn't just about one flight attendant. This is about the system that protected her. If we don't admit that, the outrage will only grow." Elaine's hands tightened on the table's edge. She hated admitting weakness, but the truth was written across every screen in the room. Live stock tickers bled red. Sentiment dashboards plummeted. Engagement metrics on Twitter showed Atlas mentioned 50 times more than any competitor, almost all negative. The storm was not passing. It was deepening. While chaos swirled in Chicago, I sat in a quiet cafe near the airport. The noise of the world condensed into the glow of my phone screen. Every notification confirmed what I had known the moment Linda Carver dismissed my documents without looking. The system was failing, not in secret, but in public. My patience had become their undoing. I sipped my coffee, unreadable, while cable anchors debated my identity. Some speculated I was a high-powered executive. Others framed me as an ordinary passenger whose dignity was stolen. Both versions suited me. Both fueled the storm. In the boardroom, Elaine's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face tightening. It was a message from Harold Wynn, the chairman of the board. 4 words: "We need control now." She exhaled sharply and addressed the room. "Prepare a press conference. Tonight, we will acknowledge the incident, announce immediate suspensions, and commit to an internal review." The head of PR shifted uncomfortably. "That won't be enough. Not with what's coming." Elaine frowned. "And what exactly is coming?" The PR lead hesitated, then turned his laptop so the room could see. Reddit threads, Twitter threads, leaks. Employees are speaking. Past complaints are surfacing. This isn't stopping. The screen showed a flood of documents. Internal memos, passenger complaints, emails with Lawson's signature closing cases, each one a crack in the dam. Elaine's knuckles whitened. "Who leaked these? It doesn't matter." The communications director said, "They're out, and once they're out, we can't put them back." The room fell silent again. For years, Atlas had operated with a confidence that its internal failures would stay hidden. Today, that illusion had shattered. On the other side of the country, passengers who had once filed complaints without response were finding their voices amplified. A woman tweeted, "I reported Linda Carver in 2018 after she accused me of forging a boarding pass. Nothing happened. Now I know why." Another posted, "Lawson dismissed my complaint after I was skipped 3 times for beverage service. He wrote, 'No basis.' I saved the email." The internet stitched these stories together like threads in a tapestry. What emerged was not an isolated event, but a systemic rot, and Atlas could no longer hide it. In Chicago, Elaine ended the meeting with clipped orders. "Carver is suspended effective immediately. Lawson as well. Draft the release. Notify unions. Prepare me for the cameras." As executives filed out, she remained at the table, staring at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city pulsed with light, but she felt the walls closing in. For the first time in her career, authority felt fragile. Her assistant approached quietly. "Ms. Turner, investors are asking if you'll resign." Elaine didn't look up. "Not yet," she said. The door closed, leaving her alone. Her reflection stared back from the glass-polished blazer. Neat hair, tired eyes. For the first time, she wondered if she was looking at the end of her career. Meanwhile, I walked out of the cafe into the cool evening air. Notifications still buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored them. The storm didn't need me to guide it anymore. It had taken a life of its own. Across the city, journalists crowded outside Atlas headquarters. News vans lined the streets. Protesters gathered with hastily made signs. Some read, "Where dignity dies, trust dies." Others read, "We are all seat 1A." The chants grew louder as cameras rolled. Employees tried to slip through side doors to avoid the crowd, but there was no avoiding the truth anymore. Inside, Elaine Turner rehearsed her lines in the mirror. "We are deeply sorry. We take this matter seriously. We are committed to change. The words tasted bitter even as she said them, because she knew what I knew. Apologies could not erase what the world had already seen. The collapse had begun, and it was only going to spread. The private lounge on the top floor of Terminal 3 was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No laughter from business travelers. No clinking of champagne glasses. Only the faint hum of air vents and the muffled drone of televisions tuned to the same story on every channel. I sat in a leather chair near the window, hands folded, posture relaxed. On the screen above the bar, the video replayed again. The same 9 minutes looped endlessly. Linda Carver's voice, Richard Lawson's dismissals, Charles Denton's smirk. The public needed no narration. The footage told the story with brutal clarity. The door opened with a hiss, and Elaine Turner entered. She walked with the confidence of someone used to commanding a room, but today it looked brittle. Her blazer was immaculate, her hair neatly pinned, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She paused when she saw me, taking in the calm with which I sat. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, not a greeting, more a calculation. "Ms. Turner," I replied, my tone even. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she circled slightly, her gaze sweeping the lounge as if searching for hidden cameras. Finally, she lowered herself into the chair opposite me, resting her folio on the table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. "You asked to see me," she said at last. I shook my head once. "No, you asked to see me." Her lips tightened. The correction landed. She opened her folio, sliding a printed document across the table. A shareholder registry. Highlighted in yellow was my name, Marcus Hale. Beneath it, the number that mattered more than any title. 22% voting interest in Atlas American Airlines parent company. "You are not just a passenger," she said carefully. I let the silence hang before answering. "No." Elaine studied me as though trying to reconcile the man in a simple hoodie with the numbers on her page. The dissonance unsettled her. For people like her, power wore suits, ties, watches that announced wealth, but real power did not need to be seen. It only needed to be revealed at the right time. "Why didn't you tell them?" she asked finally. "Why not reveal this on the flight?" "Because it would have changed nothing," I said. My voice was calm, but there was weight beneath it. Carver would still have dismissed me. Lawson would still have defended her. Denton would still have mocked me. The point was never about proving who I was. The point was testing who they were. Elaine inhaled sharply, her eyes narrowing. Testing, I leaned forward slightly, my gaze steady. "You cannot reform a system by filing polite complaints. You cannot change a culture by hoping people behave differently when they know they are being watched. You change it by revealing how they act when they believe no one is watching." Her composure wavered. She looked down at the folio again, though she had already memorized the numbers. "This is going to destroy careers," she said. "They destroyed themselves." I replied, "I am just holding up the mirror." She closed the folio slowly, her hands trembling despite her effort to appear steady. "The board will demand answers. Harold is already furious. He believes you set this up." "Did I?" I asked calmly. Elaine blinked. Her silence was answer enough. I reached into my briefcase and slid a folder toward her. Black leather, embossed with a single logo, the Atlas Reform Protocol. Inside, documents with federal seals, audit authorizations, compliance signatures. Elaine's face drained of color as she scanned the pages. "This," she whispered, "was sanctioned. Phase 1 was anonymous complaint verification. I explained. Phase 2 was passive observation through passengers like Nguyen. Phase 3 was direct engagement. The incident you watched unfold was not orchestrated. It was organic. All Carver and Lawson had to do was treat me as a passenger. They chose not to. Elaine's throat tightened. And now we decide whether Atlas reforms itself or whether it collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. She looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as a passenger, not even as a shareholder, but as something else entirely. "Who are you really?" she asked. I let the silence stretch again, then spoke softly. "A consequence." Her breath caught, and for the first time, fear flickered across her face. Not fear of me, but of what I represented. A system no longer immune, a spotlight that could not be turned off. She gathered herself, straightening her shoulders. "The board will resist. They will fight accountability. They will insist on optics over change. Then they will fail," I said, "because this is no longer about what happens inside a boardroom. It is about what millions of people now demand outside of it." Elaine leaned back, closing her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. "What happens next?" I opened the second folder in my briefcase, sliding it across to her. A list of reforms: AI monitoring of in-flight behavior, independent audits, a scholarship fund for underrepresented aviation careers, transparent reporting systems, the Atlas Protocol. I said, 5 pillars, non-negotiable. She skimmed the list, her jaw tightening with each line. "This will cost millions. It will save billions." I replied, "Trust is the most valuable currency in your industry. Lose it, and you lose everything for a long time." Elaine said nothing. Then she closed the folder and met my gaze. "If I agree to this, Carver and Lawson will not be the only casualties. There are others who enabled them, people I have worked with for years. Then they will answer for their choices." I said, "Accountability is not a punishment. It is the price of integrity." Elaine's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Finally, she rose from her chair, smoothing her blazer. "I will present this to the board in the morning." I stood as well, not breaking eye contact. "Do more than present it," I said. "Own it, because this is the only path forward." For a moment, she looked as though she might falter. Then she nodded once, sharply, decisively. "Consider it done." She gathered her folio, hesitated at the door, then turned back. "That anonymous account, the one that leaked the video, was it you?" I allowed the smallest of smiles. "No, that was never me." Elaine waited, but I offered nothing more. She nodded once, then left the lounge, the door closing softly behind her. On the muted television above the bar, the ticker at the bottom of the screen shifted.
Atlas American Airlines stock down 9%. Hashtag still trending globally. But the headline was new. Anonymous whistleblower exposes systemic bias at Atlas Airlines. Major shareholder confirmed involved. The world did not know my name yet. But soon, they would know my policy. And when they did, there would be no going back. The boardroom of Atlas American Airlines was built for confidence. Everything in it was designed to project permanence: the 15-foot mahogany table, the polished brass fixtures, the panoramic windows that looked over Chicago's skyline. The room whispered tradition and authority, the kind that believed itself untouchable. But that morning, the illusion cracked. At 8 sharp, the emergency board meeting began. 12 directors sat around the table. 11 thought they were in control. The 12th, seated at the far end with calm that unsettled the others, was me. Elaine Turner sat 2 seats to my right, her posture taut, her eyes flickering between me and the chairman. Harold Wynne, silver-haired and 76,
presided at the head with the kind of authority that came not from competence, but from longevity. He had been there since the company's early days, and he wore his tenure like armor. Harold cleared his throat. "We are here to discuss the extraordinary disruption caused by recent events. A viral video, shareholder unrest, public outrage, and a stock drop that has cost us nearly $2 billion in market value in 48 hours. His voice was heavy, deliberate. "This cannot continue." The directors murmured in agreement, some scribbling notes, others checking their phones for updates. Harold's gaze landed on me, sharp but patronizing. "Mr. Hale, while your stake in this company is significant, your conduct has raised serious concerns. You bypassed internal grievance procedures, escalated matters to the public, and jeopardized the airline's reputation. This board is moving to call a vote for your removal as a Class A director, effective immediately." A ripple of agreement passed around the table. Several directors nodded, others looked relieved, as though cutting me loose would steady the storm. I let the silence sit for 3 long seconds. Then I spoke. Denied. The word hung in the air like thunder. Harold blinked, his lips parting slightly. "Excuse me." I reached into my folder and slid 2 signed agreements onto the table. Last night, I acquired 12% of outstanding shares from 2 major investment funds. Emergent Impact Capital and True North Investments have transferred all proxy voting rights to me until further notice. Elaine's eyes widened as Harold snatched the documents, scanning them with shaking hands. The legal seals and signatures left no room for denial. "That brings my total voting power to 50.7%. I said evenly, "I am not leaving the board. I am the board." The room went still. A few directors audibly gasped. Others sat frozen, unable to process the shift. For the first time, Harold's face betrayed not just surprise but fear. "I suggest we change today's agenda." I continued calmly. "From my removal to this company's survival, one director, a younger woman from the finance sector, broke the silence. If this is true, then Marcus controls the majority. We cannot outvote him." Another director, older and red-faced, slammed a fist lightly against the table. "This is a coup, a hostile takeover." "No," I said, my voice steady. "This is a rescue." I rose slowly, walking toward the projection screen at the end of the room. With a quiet tap on my tablet, the screen lit up. The video appeared again, Linda Carver standing over me, dismissing my documents, Lawson waving them away, Denton sneering. The 9 minutes that had been watched by half the world now filled the boardroom. Directors shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Some had seen it dozens of times already, but in this room, in this moment, it carried a different weight. I clicked again. The next slide appeared 27 complaints filed against Carver over 9 years, each marked "no action taken." 16 of them signed off by Lawson. This is not an isolated failure. I said, this is a pattern, a system, a culture of dismissal and protection that has been ignored at the highest levels. A third slide appeared headlines from the past 24 hours. Stock plummeting. Hashtags trending globally. Protesters outside Atlas headquarters. This is the cost of denial. I said, billions lost. Trust evaporated. Passengers walking away. Investors panicking. I let the images hang on the screen, then spoke again, quieter but sharper. Where bias lives, trust dies. And without trust, this airline has no future. The words echoed in the silence. Harold tried to recover, his voice trembling with restrained anger. You exaggerate. A scandal, yes, but storms pass. We weather them. We apologize. We move on. I turned to him. my eyes steady. You cannot move on from what the world has already seen. You can only move through it. The difference is survival or collapse. Elaine watched me closely, her expression unreadable, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. She knew I was right. I clicked again. The final slide appeared 2 simulations of Atlas's future stock performance. Option A, denial. Option B, accountability. The difference was $3.4 billion over 6 quarters. Money talks, I said, and right now, money is screaming for reform. A director leaned forward, voice tentative. And what do you propose? I opened the black folder on the table, sliding out the documents I had shown Elaine the night before. The Atlas Protocol. I said, 5 pillars.
AI monitoring of in-flight behavior, independent audits, a $50 million scholarship fund for underrepresented aviation careers, 60 hours of mandatory training for frontline staff, anonymous passenger reporting platforms, non-negotiable. Another director scoffed. You would drag us into bankruptcy with this idealism? No, I replied calmly. I will drag you back into relevance. The younger finance director nodded slowly. Public sentiment is already shifting toward companies that act decisively. If we are first, we lead. If we are last, we die. Murmurs rippled around the table, some skeptical, others persuaded. Harold's face hardened, his authority unraveling as the tide shifted. You would dismantle everything we've built, he hissed. No, I said, my tone quiet but sharp. I will rebuild what you let rot. Silence. Finally, Elaine spoke, her voice steady. I support the protocol, publicly, immediately, one by one. Directors shifted, reluctant nods, quiet agreements. The balance of power tipping not by force, but by inevitability. Harold sat back heavily, his face pale. For decades, he had believed himself untouchable. Now he saw the truth. The world had changed, and power no longer belonged to men who hid behind tradition. By the time the vote concluded, the Atlas Protocol was adopted, not by slim margin, not by compromise, by decree of ownership, because when reform will not come from the top, you change the top, and when power refuses to listen, you become power. The press briefing room at Atlas American Airlines headquarters was overflowing. Reporters filled every seat, cameras crowded the aisles, and live feeds streamed to millions of viewers worldwide. The airline had never commanded this much attention in its history. And yet, for the executives waiting behind the curtain, it felt less like a moment of influence and more like standing before a firing squad. Elaine Turner stood at the edge of the stage, holding a set of prepared remarks. Her speech had been polished by public relations teams and legal advisors, every word carefully weighed to strike the right balance of apology and reassurance. But even as she rehearsed the first lines in her mind, she knew they rang hollow beside her. I waited. No speech cards, no teleprompter, no carefully crafted script. Just a calm expression and a folder tucked beneath my arm. Elaine glanced at me. They're expecting me to speak first, she whispered. I met her eyes, then surprised them. A moment later, the curtain drew back. The room erupted in camera flashes and murmurs. Elaine walked onto the stage, the company logo glowing on the screen behind her. She placed her notes on the podium and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. She hesitated, then she stepped back. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice firm, I will not be speaking tonight. Instead, you will hear from the man who represents both our past failure and our future possibility, Marcus Hale. The room rippled with gasps. Reporters scrambled to adjust their cameras. Some shouted questions. I walked forward slowly, each step measured, each second deliberate. When I reached the podium, I rested my hands on the edge.
letting the noise subside before I spoke. "My name is Marcus Hale." I began. My voice was calm, carrying clearly without force. Some of you know me as the passenger removed from first class. Others now know me as a shareholder. Today, I stand before you as both. Flashes erupted, fingers clattered on keyboards. I am not here to defend myself. I continued, because I do not need to. The video spoke for itself. What you saw was not just an incident. It was a symptom of something deeper. A culture where bias is tolerated, where complaints are buried, and where dignity is negotiable. The room fell utterly silent. "I am not here to humiliate this company. I said, I am here to transform it. And transformation begins with truth." I opened the black folder and lifted a set of documents. These are the Atlas Protocol reforms, effective immediately. Atlas American Airlines will implement 5 pillars of change. The screen behind me lit up, displaying the first pillar. Pillar 1, AI-powered monitoring of in-flight behavior. Every cabin interaction will now be logged and analyzed, not to invade privacy, but to protect dignity. Bias does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. This system will ensure we hear it. I let the words sink in before turning the page. Pillar 2. A $50 million scholarship fund for underrepresented communities pursuing aviation careers. This is not charity. This is equity. We will build a pipeline of pilots, engineers, and managers who reflect the passengers we serve. Reporters whispered, already typing furiously. Pillar 3, 60 hours of mandatory anti-bias training for all frontline staff. Not a 2-hour compliance video. Not a box to check. Real, scenario-based learning that changes behavior. Training will not be optional. It will be performance. The murmurs grew louder. Pillar 4. An anonymous passenger feedback platform. Reports will bypass customer service black holes and reach compliance directly. Every passenger deserves to be heard. No more silenced voices. I lifted the final page. Pillar 5, equity indexing. Every employee's conduct will be tracked and measured. Promotions will depend not only on efficiency, but on fairness. Repeat offenders will face retraining or removal. Because bias is not a personality trait. It is a liability. When I finished, the room was still. Then the questions erupted. "Mr. Hale, are you saying you designed this system yourself? Will you demand other airlines follow suit? Are you taking control of Atlas?" I raised my hand slightly, calming the storm. This is not about me. This is about trust. Atlas failed its passengers because it failed to see them. That ends today. On the screen behind me, the headline appeared, Atlas Protocol Adopted, Industry's First Comprehensive Equity Reform. I closed the folder and stepped back from the podium. For a moment, the room was hushed. Then reporters surged forward, voices overlapping, questions flying. But I was already walking off stage. The point had been made across the world. The announcement exploded onto screens. CNBC ran the headline alongside stock tickers that began climbing almost immediately. Analysts who had predicted a collapse were forced to admit the turnaround potential. Social media lit up with reactions. Finally, an airline doing something real. Atlas Protocol needs to be industry-wide. Just booked my next 3 flights with Atlas. For the first time in days, hope began to outpace outrage. In break rooms across airports, flight attendants huddled around televisions, watching me speak. Some rolled their eyes. Some looked nervous, but many nodded slowly, the weight of recognition settling in. Change was not just coming, it was here. In the control center of Atlas headquarters, sentiment dashboards ticked upward. Comments turned from fury to cautious optimism. The stock which had fallen nearly 11%, rebounded by 14 in after-hours trading. Elaine watched the monitors from backstage, her arms folded. An assistant leaned close and whispered, "We've never seen a turnaround this fast." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. "He didn't save us." She murmured, "He rebuilt us." That night, as the world processed the announcement, I sat in the quiet of my hotel room. My phone buzzed endlessly with messages from civil rights groups, government officials, even rival airlines. Some congratulated me, some begged for advice, some asked for partnership. I responded to none. I sat in silence, looking out at the Chicago skyline, its lights glittering against the dark. The announcement was not the end, it was the beginning. Because transformation is not words on a stage. Transformation is what comes after. And I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The morning after the announcement, the streets outside Atlas headquarters looked different. Just 24 hours earlier, they had been filled with protest signs, angry chants, and news vans stacked bumper to bumper. But now the crowd carried something else: curiosity. Television crews were still there, but their tone had changed. Anchors who had once described the airline as collapsing now spoke cautiously about industry-leading reforms. Headlines scrolled across the bottom of every screen: Atlas stock rebounds, public cautiously optimistic. Yet beneath the cautious hope, tension still simmered. I walked through the plaza outside headquarters in silence, a hood pulled over my head, sunglasses shielding my eyes. People did not know I was among them, and I preferred it that way. I wanted to hear what they said when they thought no one important was listening. "I still don't trust them," a man muttered, clutching his coffee. "They'll say anything when money's on the line. But this guy, Marcus Hale, he's different." A woman replied. "He didn't ask for forgiveness. He demanded change." A teenager nearby scrolled through her phone, showing her friend a video clip. "Look at this. My dad filed a complaint 3 years ago and got ignored. Now he's talking to reporters. People are finally listening." I moved on, storing the words, the skepticism, the fragile hope. Inside headquarters, the atmosphere was brittle. Executives whispered in hallways. Lawyers shuffled stacks of paperwork, and compliance officers set up temporary war rooms filled with screens and charts. The Atlas Protocol had been announced, but the machinery of change had only begun to grind into motion. In the employee lounge, flight attendants crowded around the big screen showing the internal broadcast. A recording of my announcement played on loop, the 5 pillars displayed in bold letters. Some attendants crossed their arms, skeptical. Others leaned forward, nodding. "This is going to get people fired," one said bitterly. "This is going to make us better," another countered quietly. At the back of the room, a younger attendant whispered, "I filed a complaint once. Nothing happened. Maybe now it will." The ripple had begun. That evening, I met Elaine Turner again, this time not in a polished boardroom, but in a quiet conference room converted into a strategy hub. Charts covered the walls, mapping media sentiment, employee feedback, and investor calls. Elaine looked tired but focused. "The board is split. Some are furious about what they see as your power grab. Others are relieved you've steadied the ship, but there's another storm coming." I waited. She slid a file across the table. "Competitors. United and Delta are already drafting statements. They will try to spin your reforms as unnecessary or impractical, hoping to undermine Atlas before the tide turns industry-wide." I opened the file, scanning the internal memos. Predictable. The old guard always defended itself first, even when it meant aligning with rivals. "Let them," I said softly. The public is not comparing one airline to another anymore. They are comparing justice to injustice. The competitors are playing in the wrong arena. Elaine leaned back, studying me. "Do you ever doubt this path?" I paused before answering. "Every day. But doubt sharpens the blade. If I did not question myself, I would become them." For a moment, the room was quiet. Then Elaine nodded slowly. The following week, new voices began to surface. Civil rights groups held press conferences praising the Atlas Protocol. Former passengers who had been ignored or dismissed shared their stories on social media, their voices amplified by the public mood. One man wrote, "I was escorted off a flight for asking to switch seats so I could sit with my daughter. They said I was aggressive. I filed a complaint. Nothing. Watching Marcus Hale refuse to move showed me I wasn't crazy. It happened to me too. A retired flight attendant posted an open letter I reported Linda Carver years ago. Nothing changed. I cried when I saw her face on that video. Not because I hated her, but because I finally knew the truth was undeniable. Stories multiplied. Hashtags spread. What had begun as outrage turned into testimony, and testimony turned into momentum. But not everyone welcomed the change. One evening, I received a message slipped quietly under my hotel door. No signature, no envelope, just a single line written in tight handwriting. "Leave this alone, or you will regret it." I folded the note, placed it in my pocket, and stared out the window. The city lights blinked below, indifferent to the threats of men clinging to power. Fear was their last weapon, and I had no use for it. Still, in the quiet hours of the night, doubt crept in. What if the backlash grew stronger than the reform? What if Atlas collapsed under the weight of exposure? What if, in trying to change the system, I had destroyed it entirely? I closed my eyes, breathing through the uncertainty. The questions were sharp, but so was the answer. Change is never clean. It is always born through fracture. The next morning, a surprising ally emerged. Sophie Nguyen, the quiet passenger who had filmed part of the incident, released a public statement. She revealed herself as the source of the anonymous upload, explaining why she had chosen to act. "I recorded because I saw a man being dismissed for no reason other than who he was," she wrote. "I shared the video because I knew no one would believe it otherwise. I never expected it to go viral, but if my small act helped expose the truth, then I would do it again." Her words resonated deeply. Within hours, she was invited to speak on national television. She declined most offers, preferring to stay out of the spotlight, but her single interview was enough. She described the silence of the cabin, the tension in the air, the way people looked away. She ended with a sentence that echoed everywhere. "What happens in one seat affects every passenger." The ripple spread wider. In Washington, senators began calling for hearings on airline bias. In New York, law professors debated the legal implications of equity indexing. In Atlanta, a group of young aviation students posted a video celebrating the new scholarship fund, their excitement raw and contagious. And inside Atlas, something even more profound was happening. Employees who had once stayed silent began to speak. Some filed new reports through the anonymous system. Others reached out directly to the compliance office. One wrote simply, "For the first time, I believe someone might listen." Late one night, I returned to the lounge where all of this had begun. The same leather chairs, the same quiet hum. On the television, a news anchor reported the latest numbers: stock climbing, sentiment improving, class action complaints rising, but no longer ignored. I sat alone, reflecting. Power had shifted, but not completely. The old guard would fight to preserve itself. The competitors would circle like vultures. Even within Atlas, resentment festered among those who saw reform as betrayal. But something irreversible had begun, a ripple that no threat, no denial, no tradition could stop. I thought again of that first moment in seat 2A, the flight attendant's sneer, the businessman's mocking smile. I thought of the silence I had chosen instead of rage. That silence had carried further than any outburst ever could, because silence, when used with precision, is louder than outrage. And now the world was listening. The storm did not end with the Atlas Protocol. It deepened. It tested. It stripped away the illusions until only truth remained. Within weeks of the announcement, lawsuits multiplied. Former passengers came forward, many with complaints buried years earlier. Some brought documentation, others brought memory. Together, they painted a portrait of a system that had silenced too many for too long. Federal investigators confirmed what we already knew: discrimination at Atlas was not incidental. It was systemic.
Internal files surfaced, showing patterns of neglect, patterns of dismissal, patterns of power protecting itself at the expense of those it should have served. The class action suit grew larger than anyone expected. More than 300 passengers signed on, each one carrying a story. A grandmother removed from a flight for questioning why her boarding group was skipped. A young student asked to leave first class because her clothes looked too casual. A father labeled disruptive for asking why his boarding pass was reissued for the back of the plane. Each voice became part of the record. Each testimony added weight. Inside Atlas headquarters, fear turned to resignation. Richard Lawson resigned quietly after his suspension turned permanent. He left without statement, his decades of service overshadowed by the signatures on ignored complaints. Linda Carver was terminated after the investigation confirmed the long history of bias. For weeks, her name was dragged across headlines, her face frozen in still images of that 9-minute video. But then, something unexpected happened. Months later, Linda published an essay. It was raw, unpolished, and uncomfortably honest. She wrote about how bias had seeped into her behavior without her questioning it. She wrote about the pride that had blinded her, the authority she had used like a shield, and the shame of watching herself on screen. She ended with 3 words that startled everyone: I was wrong. The essay spread quickly, not because people forgave her, but because people recognized the value of her admission. And when Atlas invited her back, not as a flight attendant, but as a trainer for anti-bias education, her decision to accept was both controversial and symbolic. She stood before employees and began her first session with the same words: I was wrong. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. It means you are listening. Charles Denton, the businessman who had mocked me on the plane, faced his own collapse. His face had become a meme, his comments repeated in articles and television segments. His company distanced itself. He issued apologies, but the internet remembered. Eventually, he disappeared from public view, a casualty of arrogance in an age of accountability. Not all endings were losses. Sophie Nguyen, once just a quiet passenger, became a voice of conscience. Her statement, "What happens in one seat affects every passenger," was repeated in editorials, quoted in speeches, even engraved on a plaque in Atlas's new training facility. She refused fame, but her words became part of the airline's DNA. Officer Elena Torres remained in her post, respected more than ever. When federal investigators reviewed her role, they praised her restraint, her professionalism, and her ability to de-escalate under pressure. She became a model of what law enforcement could be when dignity mattered more than procedure. Elaine Turner rose higher. Once skeptical, she had chosen reform, and that choice saved her career. She became the face of Atlas's renewal, not by erasing the past, but by admitting it and leading through it. And then there was me. By the time the lawsuit settled, by the time the reforms took root,
By the time the Atlas protocol spread beyond one airline to influence an entire industry, I was no longer just a passenger who refused to move. I was a consequence. 1 year later, I stood before the annual shareholder summit in Seattle. Thousands of employees watched the live stream, from pilots to baggage handlers to executives. The new CEO, a woman chosen not because she was safe, but because she was qualified and visionary, had just finished presenting record-high satisfaction scores. 94%, the highest in Atlas history.
When it was my turn to speak, I did not bring slides. I did not bring numbers. I brought a story. I told them about seat 2A, about the moment I was told I did not belong, about the silence I chose instead of outrage, about the weight of knowing that silence would travel further than shouting ever could. I told them about the grandmother, the student, the father, the passengers whose stories had been dismissed. I told them about Sophie's courage, about Elaine's choice, about Linda's admission, about the thousands who now flew with their dignity intact. I ended with this: respect is not a privilege. It is not a gift. It is not something that should be negotiated at 30,000 feet. Respect is a right, and justice is not the end of the journey. Transformation is. The room rose in applause, not for spectacle, but for principle. Later, as the summit ended, I watched a scene that told me the story had truly changed. A young girl boarded a flight with her father, a black man in a tailored suit. She clutched a toy airplane, her eyes wide with excitement. The flight attendant, new to the job, knelt to her level, handed her a pair of wings, and said, "Welcome aboard. Seat 2A is ready for you." Her father smiled, not because he knew the history of that seat, but because he did not have to. The seat was ready. It always should have been. I stepped away quietly, leaving the applause, the headlines, the cameras behind. Change was never about the spotlight. It was about the people who would never know my name but would feel the difference. And as the plane lifted into the sky, I knew the work was not done. It never would be. But for the first time, the flight toward dignity had found its course. And so, the story of Marcus Hale comes to an end. But the message must live on. What started as a flight attendant's sneer became a mirror that exposed an entire system of bias. What began as humiliation ended as transformation, and one man's silence forced the world to listen. We are reminded that respect is not a privilege, it is not a luxury, it is a right. Yet how many voices have been silenced, how many lives have been scarred, simply because someone in power chose to look the other way. This story asks us to carry more than outrage. It asks us to carry empathy, to recognize injustice not just when it happens to us, but when it happens to anyone. Because the truth is simple: when one passenger is told they don't belong, the whole cabin loses its dignity. If this story moved you, let it linger in your heart. Let it fuel your voice against discrimination wherever it hides. And before you go, please like this video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Together, we can make sure every seat, every space is a place of dignity,